Well, thank you very much, Roy, for agreeing to this brief interview at such short notice. I'm going to begin with what is probably a highly predictable question, but it may nonetheless, provide us with a good starting point. In your book, Luck and the Irish, which focuses, well, as you know, obviously on a panorama of change involving the final 3 decades of the 20th century, you refer, and I quote, to a sense that we are experiencing history in fast-forward mode as transformations accumulate, well, in every area of the polity. Now, another 20 years have passed since the turn of the millennium, and roughly 15 on that book, and I suppose, key things in politics and ethics have happened in Irish public life since. But at the level of lived experience and self-perception, how do the patterns of change in Irish society in these first 20 years of the new millennium relate to the sort of diagnosis that you were offering in this book? I mean, should you be prompted to write a follow-up, what might that be?
I think I will spare the reading public a follow-up, at least at this point. But it's interesting to read because there is an entire retrospective, an accumulating retrospective involved here. Why I wrote Luck and the Irish, which was published in 2004, I think, was because people kept saying, my publishers kept saying, you published Modern Ireland in 1988, it needs a new chapter, few chapters at the end of what happened after 1972 when you end that book. Ireland enters the EEC, which became the EU. The special position of the Catholic Church is removed from the Constitution. Modernity is happening. And I said, no, it's not a matter of adding on chapters, it's a whole new story. So after finishing Modern Ireland, I felt it needed a complete new book. And I gave lectures in Belfast, the Wiles lectures, which became this short book about the changes that had happened from the 1970s until, well, the book ended around 2000. It was published in 2003. And it was about, as you say, fast-forward change and of the way the landscape of history was receding at such a pace behind us that we could barely recognize it. Then, of course, 3 years after the book was published, the economic so-called miracle, which was part of the theme of my book, collapsed, much as in your country as well. It was very similar in Portugal and Ireland. We had this boom and then this bust. And since then, we have been a sadder and wiser people. We have recovered, we have come through. But I don't think it's a question of doing another book. The period is too short. The changes, however, since the period I was surveying in Luck and the Irish, the changes that have happened since are enormous. When I published the book, the very corrupt Prime Minister, Charles James Haughey, was still alive. And Penguin, who published the book, were very nervous about litigation because of what I had written about his corruption. He conveniently died a couple of years later, and I could have said far more. But other things that I had written partly about, such as the loss of social and moral authority from the Catholic Church because of the revelations of child abuse, this became vast. I published the book before the Ryan report on what went on in mother and baby homes. The evidence, the data now of what went on in the institutions of the state, the Magdalen laundries, the mother and baby homes, the industrial schools, that is a vast subject written about by many others. And it has, I think, involved a reorientation of self-examination in the Irish body politic, that the age of innocence, as somebody has called Ireland from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, is now no longer innocent. Fintan O'Toole has recently written a book called We Don't Know Ourselves, where he patterns his life. He's born 10 years after me in 1959, but he patterns his life against the changes in the Irish state, the Irish polity, every few years from the end of the 1950s to the present day. And again, you get a sense of fast forward. But I think if one is to write about that in a continuous way, one either does it as Fintan has done it, as a kind of diffused or displaced autobiography, or one, as I, a cautious historian, would say, of course, one sits back and waits for the perspective.
To gain a bit of distance, to gain a bit of perspective.
I think it's essential.
Still relating to change and perceptions of change, How does this bear on a sense of the past? Do you find the Irish in general viewing the past as less determining of their experience and of their current sense of themselves? Or does that still carry such a significant weight in terms of, the power to determine people's perceptions of who they are?
I think the past is always a continuous happening in Irish society and Irish culture. The great playwright Stuart Parker gives us an instruction at the beginning of one of his plays, setting Ireland, the continuous past. And it's a very plangent and pointed indication that in Ireland the past is always part of the present. In one of the papers this morning at this conference we've just been at, David Lowenthal's book, The Past is a Foreign Country, was invoked. A book that I have my problems with, but it did, when it was published in, I think, the late 70s, the early 80s, it made the point that the past is a matter of continuous negotiation for national consciousness. Less so, funnily enough, in England than in many countries. I'm always surprised at the way the English ignore inconvenient episodes in their past, the way that what would in Ireland, or I imagine in Portugal, a great national event, let's say in England the 1688 revolution, which created the modern Whig political culture which dominated English life for the next 200 years, that went by without a notice. Maybe because so much of English life is focused around continuing symbols, notably the monarchy and the Queen, that the actual interrogation or connection with their lived past becomes a rather vague and assumed identity. Here in Ireland, or there in Ireland, because we are now in Portugal, and I think in Portugal, and certainly in Spain, and in France, where of course the work of Pierre Nora was one of the great interrogators of what a continuous past means in the life of a nation. And what Nora wrote about the 200th centenary of the French Revolution has, I think, inflected the way certainly that we in Ireland think about our past. The idea that memory and history are imbricated and confusingly mixed up together in a way that it is the historian's job in a certain sense to disentangle memory and history. But more and more, as we think about national psychology more than the simple supposed parade of political events, we think about the way these things are intellectually and psychologically conceived and reordered in the national memory. And that's what we have learned from Nora. And that, I think, is essential to the way that Ireland conceives of its past. And I think the same is very true, I'm sure, in this country. Certainly yes. True in Spain and France.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, this bears directly also on what people tend to call today the cultures of commemoration. I mean, I'm now old enough to remember the huge controversies that mark the commemorative landmarks of, say, 1986, then 1989 for Yeats, 1991, etc., bearing on contested versions of those early decades of the 20th century. I mean, for Ireland, especially the period, of course, 1916 to 22. But those controversies, they may now seem, at least to an outsider like me, to belong to an older era that is even older than the 30 or 35 years that have passed on them. Is this a perception that you share, that there was a contentiousness at a certain point that is no longer there? Or how would you describe the current commemorative period and the way in which people are now relating to that particular segment in history?
It's a very important question, and it takes us back to Nora and people who write about the psychology of memory. Back in 1998, we celebrated in Ireland the 200th centenary of 1798, the great failed rebellion when Protestants and Catholics supposedly came together to try and create a new republic on the French model. And a great deal of inaccuracy was projected onto this because, of course, it was also the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Everyone wanted history, in Seamus Heaney's, as you well know, phrase, hope and history to rhyme. And people wanted the Good Friday Agreement to now be the kind of reification in the current day of a coming together in the past, which when you look at actually what happened in 1798, it's a fantasy. The Catholics and Protestants did not come together except at a certain elite level, and they split apart very quickly. Protestant political consciousness very rapidly retreated into the bunker of unionism, and the Catholics who failed in their rising became oppressed over and over again because emancipation was not given to them. But the fantasy of the memory of this moment of supposed collaboration was presented by the Irish government in 1998 as learning from history, and it was actually the opposite. It was not learning from history. The literary critic Edna Longley at that point said that the Irish should put up a monument to amnesia and forget where they put it, which I like very much and I have often quoted. Fast forward, the phrase we keep using, on to the commemorations. We are now in what is called the decade of commemorations. Historians who used not to refer to Ireland having had a revolution, because a revolution was a dangerous word that involved Russia and communism, but now we do refer to the Irish Revolution, but I think in a more nuanced way, of a 10-year revolutionary period from 1912 to 1922, followed by a period of conservative restabilization in the 20s, as revolutions often are. But since 2012, we have been involved in rather cautiously commemorating, and I use the word commemorating, not celebrating, because it's not all a celebration, but commemorating this extraordinary, again, fast-forward period. The government has put together it's a big contrast from 1998. They've put together a very carefully conceived committee who are not so much steering the commemorative jamborees as moderating them. The idea that 1916 represented only a minority of advanced nationalists, the 1916 Rising, which wouldn't have been something we would ever have admitted in, say, 1966, was very much to the fore in 2016. This was a radical minority who shifted perceptions, but the majority of Ireland, of Irish people, of moderate nationalists, did not want a violent revolution. That is clear to us historians. It would be a very unpopular thing to say. At the 50th anniversary in 1966, it was to the fore of what was being said in 2016. It was admitted that so many more Irish men and women too were involved in the World War and the Allied war effort in 1916 than were involved in the revolutionary attempted putsch, which was the Easter Rising. These nuanced and, it would once upon a time have been rather controversial ways of seeing Irish identity and Irish commitment have been foregrounded. I think the recent discussions, and I've been involved in them myself, about the commemoration of the Anglo-Irish Treaty exactly 100 years ago. It'll be the 6th of December 1921, and that is in a couple of days, will be the exact centenary of the signing of the treaty in London, which then had to go back to be okayed in Ireland and was only narrowly ratified, causing the Civil War. And the Civil War, as we said earlier in this conference, is going to be the big commemorative question. How do you commemorate something that cannot be celebrated because it was one of the most traumatic and bloody and, one might think, senseless events in the bloody and often senseless parade of violence and tragedy that is Irish history. So we'll be facing up to a very awkward memory. I think it may well be that it is a therapeutic event if it is approached in the right kind of way. And I think we nowadays in Ireland downplay triumphalism. It's a sign, I hope, of national confidence. Yeats said very sharply in, I think, 1926, when there were the riots over Sean O'Casey's play about the 1916 Rising, and there were enormous objections to this very sceptical and, I think, clear-eyed view of what the 1916 Rising was about. And Yeats said that when a country reached maturity, it achieved pride rather than vanity. And he hoped that Ireland was going to become proud rather than vain. And it was vanity that caused the controversies and the ructions and the defensive reactions against seeing one's history clearly. I think if I've seen anything happen in Ireland, especially in the last 30 years or so, it has been the achievement of national pride rather than vanity. I grew up in Ireland in the 1950s and 60s when vanity, national vanity, was very prominent. And I remember the 1966 commemorations of 1916. They were triumphalist. They were, in a sense, simple-minded. The commemorations 50 years later, when I was, of course, 50 years older, are far more, I keep using the word nuanced, but I think it is an essential word to use. And the fact that there is more than one historical reality competing for the future. I wrote once, and it's been quoted quite often, that the best history is written when you realize that people acted in the expectation of a future that would never happen. And I think that's something I think of often when I think of commemoration.
Mm-hmm. And at this level, I mean, as regards the manner in which the past is evoked and represented, do you perceive a gap between, I don't know, the non-specialized perceptions and the experience of all this as regards, I don't know, politicians and their approach to these matters, as regards also the general public and the professional take on this? That is, does this bear on professional academia, the intellectual and cultural processing of the Irish past, in a different manner from the public discourses as endorsed by politicians, as perceived in the general media? Is there a difference there?
The confluence between the academic and intellectual conception of history and that which the politicians invoke is much closer than in Britain, where you do not have an intellectually sophisticated political class. I don't mean to sound chauvinist on the Irish sense, but if you look at the kind of people who now command public discourse.
Oh, we know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
You know exactly what I mean. I don't talk particularly of the Prime Minister, though I think his rhodomontade about being a classical scholar is nonsensical. His ignorance about English history, and he would say English history, not British history, is phenomenal. The attitude of the British ruling classes, once again, towards Ireland is condescending and contemptuous in a way that we have not seen since, I said this in my paper last night, since the late 19th century. In Ireland we have, and here I will sound, I'm afraid, a little chauvinist, we have a president who is a published poet and an ex-academic, a very distinguished sociologist in his day. We have a prime minister, a Taoiseach, who I remember as a PhD student in Cork, and a very bright PhD student. I've said this to him recently, we all thought you would go very far, but we didn't realize in what direction. I think that the sophistication of the Irish public discourse in politics and notably in journalism, and again I would invoke Fintan O'Toole, is very sophisticated and has a much more delicately calibrated sense of what it takes to present a public perception of a difficult contested history. This is why the Good Friday Agreement was such an achievement, because you had intelligent enough politicians and public commentators and public intellectuals on each side. And I think Tony Blair and his advisor Jonathan Powell, who has written very interestingly about that whole period, were remarkably attuned to what needed to be done. Again, a great contrast to what's happening now. And I would say, without, I hope, being too self-congratulatory as an Irish person, that the fit between what the academics and the higher journalism is trying to suggest about our very difficult and contested and disputed history, the fit between that and what the politicians are trying to articulate is closer and more compatible than it would be in many other countries, notably in the larger island.
Yeah, that's clear enough and convincing. Now, a question that I will almost apologize for, because I think it's again predictable, but I mean, you will have been asked this before. I mean, that resonant, provocative title of yours back in 1986, We Are All Revisionists Now. I mean, for the inaugural piece of the inaugural issue of the Irish Review, how do you look look back on that era, I mean, as a professional historian, did that at the time involve a sense of commitment, even of an embattled stance, or merely of professional seriousness? I mean, how do you see that?
I got into so much trouble over that.
Yeah,
I was thinking, of course, of what William Harcourt, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, said in 1886, "We are all socialists now." And it was an amazing thing to say for a liberal, conservative liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was deliberately throwing down a gauntlet because he was going to bring in taxation of wealth in a way that nobody had dared to do. And it was one of the great instances of Gladstonian politics taking a radical step from essentially a rather right-wing perspective, but doing what needed to be done. Sorry, that's a little extra history lesson about British history. But I thought of that phrase when I was asked to write the inaugural short editorial for this journal, begun by one of my great friends, the historian Tom Dunn. And it just echoed in my mind, because I thought, since the 70s, when I was a graduate student, since my first publications from the early 1980s, I and other contemporaries of mine, Vincent Comerford, David Fitzpatrick, Marianne Elliott, we were attempting to revise the accepted chronicle of Irish history as 800 years of oppression. We were trying to suggest that there were other ways of seeing this. And Theo Hoppen, I should mention as well, who pointed out that Irish history did not move from one high point of resistance to another high point of resistance and finally achieve the liberation of an oppressed nation from Britain. It was a far more complicated period than that, process than that. And between those moments of high points of resistance, there were long periods, decades and decades of ordinary life. The concept of the history of ordinary life, of course, in the 70s was pioneered again by the French, who set so many intellectual fashions. And the analyst historians who wrote about the history of everyday life fascinated me. And when Theodore Zeldin wrote his great book about France, the history of France from the Revolution to the present, the two titles of the volumes, I still have them on my bookshelves at home. One was called France 1789 to 1980 or whatever, Intellect, Taste and Anxiety. And the other was called France 1789 to 1980. And I forget, but there were three abstractions as well, intellect, taste and anxiety, and I'm sorry, it eludes me. But it was the idea that you could write the history of abstract feelings and impose them on a nation, and therefore illuminate how that nation is comes to conceive of itself. When I began to write Modern Ireland in the early 1980s, I was thinking I will do something like this. Actually, the data for Irish history is not as rich and as complex and as provincially sophisticated as French data. So I couldn't write a history of intellect, taste and anxiety for Ireland. I wrote something that was, in the end, more of a conventional narrative. But it still tried to do what I and my contemporaries had been learning to try and do in the 1970s, which was to deconstruct the narrative and to look at alternative futures and to look at the way that what happened was not necessarily inevitable, and to look at the people who had, so to speak, gone under with an untold story. We were influenced as well by, I suppose, the history from below movement in Britain, historians like E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm, who was a colleague and a great friend of mine. And so we were trying to break up the narrative to, as Katrina Crowe has said, historians must do about commemoration, to complicate the narrative. And I suppose complicating the narrative is what I meant by revisionism. And when I said we are all revisionists now, it was simply that the way history is written no longer is answered by a straightforward narrative of oppression and liberation. It's got to be more psychologically complicated than that. And I think in that sense, we won the argument, because even people whose politics might seem superficially not the same as mine are now writing Irish history in a far more psychologically complicated way than they used to. And that was what my generation tried to put into place. Many of us David Fitzpatrick's work I keep returning to because he was a great figure in that from the 1970s on.
One final question, Roy,
I remembered Ambition, Love and Politics.
Oh,
was one
right.
volume of Zeldin's History of Modern France. Ambition, Love and Politics, and then the next volume was Intellect, Taste and Anxiety. And those abstractions have stayed with me. And when I wrote Vivid Faces, the revolutionary generation in Ireland, again I was thinking in a Zeldinist way of the life of the mind as being at least as important and often far more exciting as the life of everyday politics.
One final question, Roy, that will bring us, I suppose, back to current conditions and a sort of tentative consideration of the envisaged future, because we've been tracing the conditions for a certain sense of modernity, refashioning a whole relationship to the past, and yet this seems rather strangely challenged by conditions currently north of the border of the Irish border. Because prior to 2016, there seemed to be an expectation that we would all be witnessing a full consolidation of the promise of dissolution of sectarian boundaries that was formalized in the Good Friday Agreement. I haven't been to Northern Ireland in close to 4 years, but you have, I'm sure, and I'm sure you will have both a professional and personal perspective on current conditions there in the wake of Brexit. How does the historian, but also the citizen in you, find the 6 counties when you currently go there?
I was there a few weeks ago doing a public conversation about the commemorations, in fact, in, of all places, the throne room in Hillsborough Castle. Though I wasn't sitting on the throne. Hillsborough Castle is where, as you probably know, the monarch and her family come and stay when they're in Northern Ireland. It's a place redolent of unionism, but they're attempting to make it open to more inclusive, diverse public events, and this was one of them. I was talking about commemorationism and where things stand at the moment with my great friend Richard English, Professor of Politics at Queen's University. The audience was, I hope I don't get into trouble for this, but they were what have been referred to by my friend Paul Bew as garden centre prods. Nice middle-class people in Barbers who go to the garden centre on Sunday and would be fairly unthinkingly unionist. I know that sounds very abstractionist and reductionist, but I know audiences when I see them. And I talked about the effect of Brexit, and I said, as I said last night at this conference, something about the contempt with which the British government is now treating Ireland, north and south, and how we hadn't seen such a brainless and outrageous treatment of Ireland since the late 19th century. And there was a ripple of applause, even from these very nice garden centre Protestants. I could sense that there is a feeling, there is a shift of the tectonic plates because of the idiocy of Brexit, because of the catastrophe for the Northern Ireland economy, which this parade of conflicting assertions about we will never have a border down the Irish Sea. Well, of course you will have a border down the Irish Sea. You have a border there, or you have a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Republic, because you have to have a border somewhere, because you are now on the border of a different political entity, the EU. The idiocy of claiming that you could have it both ways, which the current British government is very good at doing, and then being unable to live with the contradictions in which they have summoned up. This is being seen in Northern Ireland and Armavay in Southern Ireland, in the Republic, as something that cannot be sustained. And I think it has brought, in my view, the idea certainly of a border poll, of a referendum on whether the border should be done away with, on whether Ireland should be reunited, and I put re in inverted commas because I'm not entirely sure Ireland ever was united since the 17th century, but there may be an attempt to bring together, one would hope in a kind of federal way, with an overarching Council of Ireland, because the northern statelet will have to keep some sort of independent status apart from the rest. But I think this will probably happen within my lifetime, which I never thought it would. And it will happen probably in the wrong kind of way. It will happen, I'm afraid, with violence, because there will be a great backlash from the more irredentist sides of unionism, as there has already been a backlash from the irredentist sides of nationalism after the Good Friday Agreement. You have the continuity IRA, the real IRA. The extremes will not be reconciled. But I think such has been the ineptitude of the British government, such has been the catastrophic result of the Brexit vote by a tiny majority in Britain. And of course, it didn't, Northern Ireland did not vote to leave the EU, as Scotland did not vote to leave the EU. But metropolitan government has imposed this very crude straitjacket, this blanket on them. And it is already causing economic mayhem in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And I believe it will cause, it's not too much to say, a political mayhem to follow. So those are my personal feelings about where we stand now in this very edgy moment of history.
Well, let's hope all the parties involved will be able to consider their best interest and, intervene in the fashioning of the present and of the immediate future in ways that will also ensure the welfare of the future generations. Well, Roy, thank you very much for this conversation. This was a pleasure. I hope we'll keep converging at events like this and updating our conversation. Thank you.
I hope so, Ree.